lift up of the lockdown, where the nationwide lockdown cannot be abruptly lifted. That was the overriding message when Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs Minister Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma and other ministers briefed the public yesterday on amendments to the State of National Disaster Regulations. So Dlamini-Zuma explained on regulations that have been amended to ensure the economy is incrementally opened. To discuss this further, we're joined via Skype by political analyst Ralph Mathekga. Ralph, good to have you. Thanks so much for being our guest here.
Good morning to your viewers at home. Thanks for inviting me.
It's an absolute pleasure. So, Ralph, just very quickly, your overriding thoughts from yesterday's presentation.
Well, I think government is facing a very tough reality here. They have to begin to start thinking of an exit strategy out of this lockdown. Whatever you call it, the end of a lockdown, easing out of a lockdown. The reality is that the pressure now is for government to try to achieve the maximum goals of what it wants with this restriction. That is to make sure that you limit the spread of the virus. But at the same time, you are trying to balance and to do it in a way that you try to return people to some level of functionality here. So this is a balancing act, and I think they will continue playing around with some of the ideas, and they will be talking to experts as to what other areas easing can happen and so forth. And I think this is a global phenomenon. We're seeing governments across the world struggling by all means, at pains, trying to bring their societies to function.
Yeah, and that is the reality, is that, you know, this is something, and I got the feeling yesterday, and I'm sure you have during this entire time, this is a learning process, that this is being thought out every hour of the day as to what will happen next. And there are things that are implemented, and then there are things that are taken away and eased up and moved. You know, it really is a game of chess, of not knowing, you know, we moved this here, but maybe this wasn't a good idea. Let's rather move it there. Let's do this. Do you also get that sense that it's kind of almost like building an airplane while we're flying it?
Exactly. I mean, each and every time I have to look at this, the manner in which government is implementing, I always throw in a big disclaimer that nobody has been here before.
Exactly.
This is a mammoth task, and there is no script here. We have seen people fumbling, and each and every day, if you're government, you try to look as to where can I remove irritations that my society is struggling without endangering them. That is the balance. You do something, maybe a week down the line, you realize that no, that was a mistake. Let me try. I mean, look at now. The Liquor Forum is taking government to court, and government will have to then explain what is the rational basis of total banning of alcohol. And again, government realized that there is a case to answer here. You cannot just dismiss them. I mean, you have to make a case to say, if we do this, we think the risks are here and there. I mean, it's so difficult to balance societies that have been so used to freedom, our freedom to movement and freedom of consumption and so forth. I mean, it's who we are. But suddenly we are being told that, look, to survive, these are new measures. You're going to have to live by these measures. It's not coming to an end anytime soon, Leanne. Let's just not be naive about this. Chances of us seeing people filling stadiums are far less in the next 10 months or so, until we are completely safe.
Yeah, and that is a reality, and I think people need to keep that in their mind the entire time, that once life does resume, it is not going to look the same. It can't look the same. You know, I mean, we saw yesterday the figures coming out where, you know, we had the highest death toll that we've had in a single day, and there is still a lack of testing of all people in South Africa. And we still haven't done 100,000 tests. And industries that are now opening up and allowing people to go back to work, I mean, especially in something like the mining industry, in call centers, because these are some of the amendments that we're seeing, that all oil refineries, coal mines, platinum, iron ore, these are all running. Call centers, I think I've mentioned that, are just some of them. Now, this may actually be a double-edged sword, because this may already start a bigger spread. What do you think of this?
I mean, Leanne, indeed, I mean, I fully agree with you there. I've had people saying that we need to go back to the economy need to function, and desperately so. I mean, even at the White House, we've seen President Donald Trump desperately saying, being unrealistically optimistic and saying people need to go back. And again, I'm also seeing this thing of our government being unrealistically optimistic. I mean, the level of tests that you're doing is just not acceptable. There are people out there who are testing 50,000 a day. There are people who are targeting to test 70,000 a day. Because the problem, Leanne, is that you need to test this virus faster than it can move. If you do not do that, you are just working on the basis of hope, and hope is not a plan. So I do understand the desperation by government, but we need to be very realistic and understand here that you cannot spin this virus. Public relations fails when it comes to this virus, Leanne. You wake up with a deadly record, and our daily toll is beginning to escalate. It is actually going against our level of optimism. We need to be realistic and say that, look, let us deal with this. If we're going to do this, let's do it fully. We cannot spin our way out of this. We've got to do the work of testing.
You know, Ralph, we also need to look at who we are as a country. And I've been hearing these conversations all over the place, wherever you turn. It seems that, you know, in certain areas we're following first world countries in terms of handling COVID-19, locking down an economy and stopping small businesses from operating and all of these kind of things. But in reality, we're a third world country, and that there are people struggling and have been struggling to fill their tummies and put food on the table and survive on a daily basis, even before COVID-19. And now the situation is getting out of control. Is there a fair enough argument there that we are perhaps not handling the situation well enough for the context of the society that we live in and the economy that we have?
I think what we did, and again, I want to emphasize, nobody has been here before. That is the disclaimer. But I think that we should have been more aware of our social situation. I mean, I think we securitized it excessively. We were too much about boots on the ground. We did not look much into the social aspect of this. I mean, the departments that have been the most prominent in this have been the defense and the police. Those are boots on the ground kind of a departments. You need social development to be coming out here, understanding that the consequences of putting soldiers on the ground, putting those boots on the ground, it is going to express itself in a social way, stress and so forth. We haven't even begun, Leanne, talking about mental illness that will come out of this thing. I mean, people need to understand locking people under this condition. We understand we have to do it, but it is abnormal. We are not meant to exist in this manner. So we need to look at all aspects of this, understanding the vulnerability of our people, that most of the people do not live in condition where they can readily just comply with this thing. Hence our security forces out there. I understand they get irritated with our people. I understand the perception that our people have been unruly throughout. But all I'm saying is that let us show compassion. We cannot overemphasize the security. Let us show the social compassion for the vulnerable as we deal with this.
Yeah. Let's sort of put on a scenario that you possibly think could work better for South Africa. We heard what government had to say yesterday. What other issues do you believe need to be addressed right now in order to avoid more damage to the economy? I mean, just in terms of mining, let's focus there for a little bit, because we have seen some operations, but there are other mines that are already ordering notices saying that they've had to retrench a lot of their workers and they can't continue operating under these situations. So let's talk about a scenario that you believe that could help the economy a bit more.
Mining was already under pressure. Unfortunately, Leanne, you don't make an appointment for a disaster such as this. It just hit you. And it hit us while we were having problems in mining, retrenchments in mining. And I've seen people wanting to go back. And there are going to be tensions, no doubt, around retrenchment. People are going to go to CCMA courts and so forth. It's going to be a long, drawn battle. But I think that we need to understand as well, even within the sector of mining, that it is not going to be business as usual. The reality, Leanne, we are going to see automation, mechanization, if you like, in the mining sector. That is where the problem is. I think that what we need to be doing, we need to be looking at South Africa geographically. We need to think in spatial planning. We need to understand that South Africa, as much as it is a single country, we can have a better spatial planning, isolate the virus in certain regions. Certain regions should be able to function. We need to start thinking in a smart way. We cannot just think around the country just across the sectors or just as a unit of a geography where everything else is the same, we will not be able to defeat this virus. I'm of the view, Leon, that our geography favors a good spatial approach to this thing. I mean, literally, if you ramp up testing in Mpumalanga, for example, you can establish the level of localization there where the problem is. And I think you can bring them to function to a certain extent, but you can tell them, don't interact too much with Gauteng. The challenges are in Gauteng. You can lessen the measures across the country, depending also on the geography. But that requires that you know a lot about what's happening on the ground, Leon. You cannot guess. You need to be able to test very rapidly, get to a result. And those that are going to come out of this virus early across the globe are going to be those that are the most adaptable. But those who want to stick to their old argument, battles and everything, they are going to be left. They are not going to be able to get back to the world in an easy way. People need to adapt. We just can no longer do it the same. No matter how we used to bicker in the past and so forth, at this point, we have to find a way to function in a society where things are very difficult.
Yeah. Let's also look at in terms of the cigarette and the alcohol sales, because that, of course, has been a major contentious issue here in South Africa, where you find that citizens are desperate for that to be reopened and to be allowed to buy some of the alcohol beverages and, of course, cigarettes. But, you know, these industries also come with a lot of their own challenges. I mean, firstly, this is a big revenue maker for government that they are losing out on the taxes on this particular sale. And there is the illicit trade that is now flourishing. And we know that this is happening. I mean, it's obvious that if you can't get it legally, you're going to find it illegally. What are your views on this?
Well, I think that, you take up the measures, well intended, but you then realize along the way that, look, the circumstances have changed. The reaction, maybe I did not anticipate. I mean, Leon, the reality is that the problem of alcohol has created a new problem altogether, which almost look like bigger than that of policing people under corona. I mean, having to make sure bottle stores are not being looted and having to police illicit cigarette and so forth creates such a problem. It takes so much of resources of South African police services to a point where one can say it's just no longer rational. I mean, at some point, it's not about being tough. It's about being rational. And if your resources are so drawn to one thing that is becoming a new separate problem altogether, you've got to think different. I've had ideas coming out in the Western Cape where people are saying, let us put alcohol in a centralized area where we can be able to protect it. And that just might be a reasonable thing to do, because unless you don't do that, you're going to spend the next few days attending to alcohol and cigarette-related crimes that are much bigger, that they take you away from the central core. Remember, this is not an alcohol and cigarette consumption, I would say, management task. We're trying to keep people at home, and we are trying to keep them at home under less irritation as possible. There's no need to just be tough for the sake of it. Evaluate your measures and realize if you need to adapt. Unless otherwise, if any strategy, whatever strategy that you are using, it's not adaptable to the circumstances, that's when you end up with a situation where at the end you say, I've succeeded very well, but the patient is dead. It cannot be.
And that's the reality. And I mean, we're seeing as the days go by, people are now looting, people are now, whether it's pure criminality or desperation, those are arguments that I suppose one can have a look at both sides, because there are people that are desperate. They cannot get food. They can't earn money. But then, of course, there is that issue of going and looting bottle stores, and that's maybe an issue of desperation. What do you think about that? I mean, let's get your views on what is going to happen over these next 13, 14 days that we know of in lockdown.
I think first and foremost, let's put something of principle out there that let us try to rationalize everything else to make sure we sustain a lockdown. And I think that maybe some other day, once we are done with corona, we can come back and volunteer into an alcohol lockdown. We can come back maybe and try something like that where we are fighting the social problem. I think the problem is when we are mixing our battle on the social problem of alcohol and consumption of those issues, now with trying to get it along fighting the pandemic, which is just we cannot get all these things done at the same time. And I think that at some point, when we are done with all of this, we need to have a conversation to say, how did we get to a point where we loot alcohol stores? How did we get to a point where alcohol is so important that it helps us to escape so much? What are the issues? And we can have that separate discussion. But at this point in time, Leanne, you cannot just trample upon people's liberties and do it without giving reason. That is why government has to explain the rationality of continuing with a total alcohol ban. You don't have to be an alcohol consumer to understand the logic. My view is that under any circumstances, if you are going to trample upon people's liberties, it has to be the last resort. You have to explain yourself. And as government, don't get irritated when people say, explain how this should continue to be understood as rational.
Yeah. Let's talk to our unemployment rate. I mean, we saw the Moody's rating agency recently predicting that South Africa's economy will shrink by 2.5% this year. I mean, our unemployment rate is already sitting at around 30%. That's expected to get even higher. I mean, you know, there's so many predictions out there as to where we may end up, but this is real. This is real. Let's talk to that. I mean, we are worried about the health of South Africa, but we're also got to be concerned about the health of our economy.
Indeed. I mean, it should not be the case that people decide which death they prefer, where it's like you're going to be killed by a virus in the next 2 weeks or be killed by hunger in the next 3 months. We should not get people to those choices. We should try to balance in a way that when we come out of this, people can still be able to sustain livelihood. But again, Leanne, it's going to require the level of creativity that I have not seen among us. We have to think differently. Already we were sitting at over 30% or in that range of unemployment. We're headed towards over 40%. Of unemployment, 50% of unemployment. It's not being outlandish here. It is possible. And you're talking about 2.5% contraction of the economy. Some people are projecting up to 5%. Remember, we were already weak when we came into this virus. So we are going to have to think very differently. Again, we have to think in a spatial way. We've got to look at our competitive advantages. We are going to have to make sure that agriculture, we work hard at agriculture level. The world needs food. We are going to have to think in that way. And again, we are going to understand as well that the supply chain across the world is no longer going to be the same. It's not going to be restored in the same way. We are going to have to find ways in which we can build an economy that is resilient also internally, where we are trying to build local capacity, looking at our own strong points. We are going to think very, very, very differently. And I think we have to step away from ideologies, and I think the manner they consume us, we are not going to be able to get anywhere near the solution if we go back to our old battles.
Let's look at industries that are really, really struggling now, and nothing was mentioned for them yesterday. I mean, if we look at the manufacturing industry, one can only feel, you know, desperate for the manufacturing industry. Tourism is an industry that, of course, is a huge money spinner for the economy, and that has come to a grinding halt. And whether or not that will recover anytime soon is something that's, you know, very, very difficult. I mean, let's look at retailers. Retailers are absolutely struggling at a time like this. They're not allowed to open. They're not allowed to sell. We don't know where that leaves them. Restaurants. Again, in other parts of the world, there is some provision made that at least restaurants can do takeaways. But, you know, I was listening, I think, to something yesterday where it was saying that in order for a restaurant just to open, it'll cost them about 60,000 Rand just to open their doors to buy new stock that, of course, by now has gone off, and they've got to buy new produce and everything. I mean, these sectors and these industries are huge employers, and we don't know where they stand.
That's the problem. I mean, the tourism industry is going to take a while to pick up. There's no doubt about it. And Leanne, now government has, with this regulation saying we must stay at home. The reality is that humankind, we have fear. I mean, when we leave our homes, it's not going to be so easy for people to just go and resume with tourism and so forth. There is still the psychological aspect of it where people will need some level of safety, some level of assurance before they go into those venues and so forth. So it's going to take a while. The manufacturing, it is the one that is also struggling as well. And unfortunately, that's where we are the world has got one manufacturer, that is China, and the order is going to continue where we just buy goods from China. I think that when you look at the retail, that's where the challenge are. Shopping malls are there. People invested in shopping malls. I think that people who are going to start making money maybe are the people who are going to think creatively around the warehouses, because online shopping is going to be big. The malls, you're already seeing defaults in rental in the malls now. The portfolio of malls, they are not going to perform very well. So each and every sector will have to reinvent itself. There is no sector that one can say it's been favored by this. Maybe perhaps one can say online shopping, those platforms that exist already, we are going to see a lot of people moving in that direction. So we are going to think differently. These are uncharted territory. We need creativity. We need to get away from our previous biases. We need to let go of mistrust that we harbored against each other. We've got to think, how can we return to function in a world that does not guarantee us any certainty? It's going to be difficult for all of us.
It certainly is. Ralph, we thank you so much for talking to us here on the programme, a range of issues that have been covered. I wanted to get to education, but I'll have to leave that for another discussion that we'll also be having here on the programme with regard to online learning and the school terms and universities and all of those things. Now, Ralph is a political analyst talking to us about the amendments that are being made to the current lockdown regulations and our economy with regard to COVID-19. Ralph, always a pleasure. Right, the time.